prime regret. Thomas never thought a simple Amazon delivery could ruin his life. But now, every time a package arrived, his stomach clenched in knots, and his heart pounded like a drum. It all started with his wife, Emily, and her problem. Emily didn't just love Amazon. She lived for it. Their house looked like an overstocked warehouse, with brown boxes piling up in every corner. It got so bad they finally signed up for Amazon Key, a service that let delivery drivers drop packages right into their garage. At first, it was convenient, but last Saturday, it became his worst nightmare. That morning, Emily had gone out shopping with her friends, like she needed to buy more stuff. Thomas, on the other hand, was dealing with a stiff back and figured the hot tub in their garage would help, not wanting to walk back to the house dripping wet afterward. He stripped naked in the bedroom, walked into the connected garage, and made his way across the 3-car space toward the bubbling water. That's when he heard it, the garage door. His body froze. For a second, he thought Emily had come home early, and rather than panicking, a naughty idea popped into his head. Maybe she'd enjoy a little preview of what was waiting for her later. He was already standing at full attention, after all. Then, through the rising gap on the garage door, he saw them. Hairy legs. Emily didn't have hairy legs. Thomas barely had time to react before he slipped. His foot skidded on something, an old Amazon box, a stray shipping label, whatever it was. He'd never know. All he knew was that gravity betrayed him. He went down hard, flat on his back, smacking his head against the concrete floor. The garage spun for a moment, then footsteps. "Oh my God, are you okay?" a voice called. Thomas blinked. He was naked, on the ground, with an erection. And standing over him was the Amazon delivery guy, an overly flamboyant man Thomas had spoken before. The kind of guy you could tell was gay from the moment he opened his mouth. And now, that guy was staring directly at him. The driver's eyes widened slightly, and then his lips curled into a knowing smile. "Well, hello there." Thomas scrambled to cover himself, his brain scrambling for an excuse, a distraction, anything. This isn't what it looks like." The driver tilted his head. He hummed, not convinced. Then, to Thomas's horror, he added, "Is that for me?" No. Thomas blurted. Then, in the single dumbest moment of his life, he muttered, "But maybe you could help me with it." It just happened. The garage door shut. Clothes came off. And before he knew it, Thomas found himself in the swirling warmth of the hot tub, reliving his experimental college days. The heat, the steam, the hands exploring his body. It all came rushing back. He had forgotten how fun it could be, but he had also forgotten something else. He was married. By the time it was over, reality crashed down on him like a wrecking ball. What had he done? He watched as a delivery driver dried off, dressed, and winked at him before heading back to his truck. From that moment on, Thomas lived in pure terror. Every day, Emily's Amazon addiction sent him into a panic. Every time he heard the doorbell, he felt his stomach twist. What if it was him again? What if Emily saw the way the guy looked at him? What if the driver said something? Days passed in nervous paranoia. Then, one afternoon, the doorbell rang. Thomas peeked out the window, his heart hammering. There he was. The delivery driver stood on the porch, a box in hand, a knowing smirk on his face. Thomas swallowed hard and slowly opened the door. "Got another package for you," the driver said, his eyes twinkling with mischief. Thomas was so screwed. Prime regret. Part 2. Thomas barely had time to process his anxiety before the delivery driver spoke. "Is Emily around?" His stomach dropped. Was this it? Was the guy about to tell her everything? He forced a casual chuckle. No, she's not home right now." The driver's smirk widened. "Good." Before Thomas could react, the man leaned in and kissed him. Thomas barely had time to register the warmth of his lips before they both stumbled backward into the house. He fumbled for the door, kicking it shut behind them. His heart was pounding, a mix of fear, guilt, and something much more primal. "We gotta make this quick," Thomas whispered, breathless. "Emily will be home from work in an hour." The driver's eyes glowed with mischief. "Lucky for you, This was my last stop of the day. Thomas raised an eyebrow. He made sure of it this time. The driver added with a wink, "Can't have another late delivery complaint. Now can we?" Without another word, they made their way into the living room. Thomas dropped onto the couch, spreading his legs apart, and the driver instantly knew what to do. He sank to his knees, eager, hungry, his head disappearing into Thomas's lap as pleasure washed over him. Thomas's mind drifted. Back to college, back to his last time with another man, his old roommate, the stolen nights, the whispered moments of exploration. It had been years, but the memory still lit a fire in him, the fire he thought had gone out, the fire he had tried to put out. But here it was again, burning hotter than ever. The driver wasn't just taking, Thomas was giving, too. And by the time it was all over, they were both left breathless, panting, a mess of tangled limbs and guilty satisfaction. Thomas wiped his mouth, still dazed, as the driver adjusted his uniform. Then headlights, the sound of tires crunching on gravel. Thomas's blood ran cold. Emily was home. The driver didn't even flinch. With the smooth confidence of a man who had done this before, he grabbed a package from his satchel and turned to the door just as Emily stepped out of her car. "Afternoon, ma'am," he called cheerfully, handing her the box as if nothing had happened. Thomas swallowed hard, watching his wife beam at the sight of another package. "More Amazon?" she giggled. "I really need to stop." Thomas forced a smile. "Oh, I hope not," the driver said, flashing Thomas a quick, knowing glance. As Emily happily took the package and walked inside, Thomas stood frozen, heart racing. The driver gave him one last smirk before walking back to his truck. Thomas exhaled. He wasn't sure if he was relieved, or if he was in even deeper trouble than before. Prime regret. Part 3. That night, Emily was feeling frisky. Thomas, however, was spent. She curled up next to him in bed, her body pressed against his. She had put on something lacy, something she knew he used to love. But tonight, he just wasn't feeling it. She slid her hand under the covers, trailing her fingers along his body, whispering in his ear. Nothing. Little Thomas was out of service. She sighed, pulling away, frustration clear in her voice. "What's wrong?" Thomas hesitated. He could lie. He could say he was tired. He could blame stress. But the truth was, she just didn't do it for him anymore. It wasn't just that she had put on some weight over the years. That didn't really bother him. It was the state of the house. Boxes, everywhere, piled on the floor, stacked against the walls, cluttering every surface. They were drowning in Amazon packages. Thomas felt like they were one bad day away from being featured on Hoarders. He sat up with a sigh. "Emily, you gotta stop with all the shopping." She frowned. "What?" "We don't even have space to walk in here. You don't need any more stuff." Emily pursed her lips. "I guess maybe you're right." Thomas blinked. That was easy. "So, no more Amazon?" he pressed. She nodded. "Okay, no more orders." For the first time in a long time, Thomas actually felt relieved. Meanwhile, the delivery driver wasn't handling the separation well. He needed to see Thomas again. It wasn't just that Thomas was well endowed, though, God, that was a bonus. It was a thrill, the secret, the way Thomas made him feel. But days passed. No more deliveries. Nothing going to Thomas's house. That was when he snapped. If Thomas wasn't ordering, then he would. A small, random item. Something Emily wouldn't even remember ordering. He'd make sure it was addressed to their house. He'd make sure he was the one to deliver it. He even drove by a few times, studying their schedules. When Emily's car was there, when Thomas's truck was there alone. And then, finally, he made his move. When Thomas opened the door and saw the driver standing there with a box, his stomach twisted. Emily had promised. Seriously? Thomas muttered. She said she'd stop ordering. The driver just smiled. "Mind if I come in?" Thomas hesitated, then stepped aside, shutting the door behind them, upstairs, to the bedroom. This time it was different. The thrill of doing it in his bed, the bed he shared with his wife, it set something off in him. They started slow, exploring each other, until it escalated. Fast, urgent. By the time it was over, they were both wrecked, physically drained, sweat-covered, completely spent in every way possible. The driver slipped out quickly before Emily got home, leaving behind nothing but memories and the scent of sin in the air. What he forgot to tell Thomas. That package? He had ordered it himself. Emily walked in the door, eyes immediately landing on the box. What the hell? Thomas sighed. Emily, seriously? You said no more orders. She crossed her arms. I didn't order anything. Yeah, right. I didn't. The tension exploded. Accusations. Shouting. Thomas snapped. I can't do this anymore. Emily's eyes widened. What do you mean? He took a deep breath. I want a divorce. Prime regret, part 4, the divorce. The house was a mess. So was the divorce. What started as tense arguments turned into an all-out legal war. Thomas began snapping photos. Evidence of the conditions he was living in. Boxes everywhere. The kitchen reduced to a narrow path. The spare room so packed with junk that you couldn't even step inside. A 4-bedroom house for just 2 people. Yet there was nowhere to live. They were supposed to have children. That was the plan. But Emily had struggled with conception. That's when the shopping started. Filling the empty spaces. Filling the void. Thomas understood her pain. He was hurting too. But he never blamed her for not being able to have kids. It was the hoarding that broke him. Out of spite. Emily placed one last order. She knew she wouldn't be there to receive it. But she wanted to piss him off. One more box. One more reminder of what had ruined their marriage. What she didn't know was that package would arrive when she was gone. When the driver knocked, Thomas yanked the door open. Their eyes met. No words. Thomas pulled him inside. The tension, the rage, the need. They didn't even make it past the hallway. Right there, against the door. Anyone could have walked in. Anyone could have seen through the window. Didn't matter. The risk made it hotter. This time, Thomas took control. Turned the driver around. Claimed him. It was raw, desperate, intense. And when it happened, when Thomas felt himself release, he felt it leave his body in powerful waves. At the same time, the driver finished without even touching himself. The mess landed across the side table. Neither of them cared. Spent, breathless, the driver dressed and left. Thomas, legs weak, stumbled into the living room, still naked, still tingling. By the time he pulled himself together, he jumped into the shower, washed off the evidence, and got dressed. He sat on the couch. Relaxed. He had forgotten one thing. The side table. When Emily walked through the door, she froze. The air felt thick. It smelled different. Sex. She went from room to room, sniffing. Something inside her snapped. She spun around, eyes blazing. Who is she? Thomas blinked. What? Who is she? Emily was losing it. Emily, you are crazy. You're imagining things. Emily knows he is lying. She didn't buy it for a second. Her eyes narrowed. You're seeing someone. She wouldn't let it go. She knew. And no matter how much he denied it, she was right. Prime regret, part 5, the breaking point. Emily wasn't letting this go. Thomas could feel it. The way she paced the house, eyes darting around, digging for proof. She checked his shirts for perfume, his phone for suspicious calls. Even his truck, scanning for a stray hair, a smudge of lipstick. Anything confirmed her worst fear. But she wasn't going to find a damn thing. Because Thomas wasn't cheating with some woman. He was getting wrecked by the delivery guy. And the evidence was right under her nose. Literally. Why does it still smell like sex in here? Emily muttered under her breath, wrinkling her nose as she walked past the side table again. Thomas sat stiffly on the couch, flipping through the channels, pretending like his whole world wasn't on the verge of collapse. It's all in your head, Em, he said, trying to sound casual. Her eyes flicked to him, sharp. Is it? She asked. Before he could answer, she stormed the front door and swung it open. His stomach dropped. She was looking outside, looking down the street, as if she was expecting someone. Thomas's blood ran cold. Did she know? No, she couldn't, but she suspected, and that was almost worse. Emily turned back, her arms crossed. Nobody's here. Yeah, Thomas said, forcing a smirk. Did you think your imaginary mistress was going to come knocking? She scowled. He knew he was barely holding it together. One wrong move, one slip-up, and everything would come crashing down. Emily let out a long breath, rubbing her temples. I can't deal with this, she muttered. I need to clear my head. She grabbed her purse and keys. I'm going to my sister's for a few hours. Thomas exhaled internally. Okay, he said, keeping his voice steady. Emily glared at him one last time before slamming the door behind her. As soon as her car pulled out of the driveway, there was a knock. Thomas's heart jumped. He yanked the door open. The driver stood there, eyes dark, breathing heavy. He was hungry. So was Thomas. Without a word, Thomas grabbed him by the shirt and yanked him inside. The door slammed shut, and this time, they didn't even make it to the bedroom. Prime regret, part 6, the addiction. It was never supposed to be like this. Thomas told himself after every encounter, after every moment of fleeting escape, that it would be the last time, but it never was. The driver kept showing up, and Thomas kept letting him in. They never spoke about it, never exchanged numbers, never made plans, and that was what made it so dangerous. Every time the driver knocked on that door, Thomas's heart would race, not knowing when it would happen, not knowing if he was truly alone. The unpredictability stirred something inside him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. But now it wasn't just a rush, it had become a need. Tonight, Emily was out again, off at her sister's, trying to process their unraveling marriage. Thomas sat in the dimly lit living room, the cool bottle of beer in his hand, the weight of his thoughts pressing in on him. He told himself again that tonight would be the night to end it all, to walk away, to get his life back on track. Then, knock, knock, knock. His grip tightened around the bottle. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, told himself not to move, but his body betrayed him. Without even thinking, his feet carried him to the door. His hand reached for the handle. Before he could stop himself, the door swung open. The driver stood there, his familiar presence almost soothing in its certainty. There was a quiet understanding between them. No words, no need for explanation. Thomas didn't hesitate. He reached out, pulling him inside, feeling the connection between them without needing to say a thing. The closeness was intense, almost suffocating, but in that moment, Thomas didn't care. It was like coming home to something he had long denied. They didn't make it past the hallway this time. Hands found each other with a softness that surprised Thomas. No frantic rush, no chaos, just a simple need to be near someone who didn't ask questions, who didn't demand anything from him. And yet, it wasn't just about the physicality anymore. It was about something deeper, something he didn't quite understand but couldn't ignore. As they stood there, together in that moment, Thomas realized he wasn't just looking for an escape. He was looking for something he hadn't found in a long time. Connection. In that fleeting, intimate exchange, Thomas found a sense of relief, a quiet understanding that for once, he wasn't alone in his turmoil. But even as he felt that momentary peace, the reality of what he was doing loomed in the background. He knew this could ruin everything, his marriage, his peace of mind. But for just a moment, he allowed himself to be caught up in the rush of intimacy. He didn't stop. He couldn't. Prime regret. Part 7. The consequence. The next morning, Thomas woke up alone. The weight of his own body felt heavier than it ever had before. He was tangled in the sheets, his mind still buzzing from the night before, but now filled with an overwhelming sense of guilt. The thrill had come and gone, but the aftermath lingered like a dark cloud. He rolled over and reached for his phone, mindlessly scrolling through it, trying to ground himself. The memories from the previous night played in his mind, flashes of quiet touches, of stolen moments. But there was also the underlying dread. He knew this couldn't go on forever. Emily was still out there, still trying to rebuild her life, and Thomas had just driven a deeper wedge between them. He sighed, the sound escaping his lips like a confession. It was a habit now, the self-reassurance. This was supposed to be the last time, he told himself. But was it? His phone buzzed, and his heart skipped a beat. A message from Emily. Coming home soon. Don't forget to clean up after yourself. Thomas quickly locked the phone and tossed it aside. She wasn't asking for anything but space. She had no idea. He hadn't even told her about the mess he had made of their marriage. And now this, another secret to bury deep. He couldn't keep doing this. His eyes darted to the empty spot on the couch where the driver had been just hours before, and something in him broke. Not physically, but emotionally. He had let himself go too far, hadn't he? This wasn't just an affair. It was a crisis, a break in his own soul, and no amount of passion could fix it. The doorbell rang again. Thomas froze. A knot formed in his stomach, and a rush of nerves flooded him. He didn't have to open it. He knew who it was. The driver was here, and part of him wanted to ignore it. But the other part, the part that had been aching for connection, was already halfway to the door. He opened it without thinking. There he stood, the driver, just like always, that same quiet certainty in his eyes. No words, no pretense. But this time, Thomas could feel the weight of the situation hanging between them. Thicker than before, the driver stepped forward, as though he had sensed Thomas's hesitation. He paused, eyes locking with Thomas's, and for the first time, there was a vulnerability in him too. "Are you okay?" the driver asked, his voice softer than Thomas had ever heard it. For a moment, Thomas didn't know what to say. What could he say? He was in too deep, too far gone. And yet, here was this person standing in front of him, offering him a kind of solace that he couldn't explain. Not with words, not with anything. "I'm fine," Thomas said, his voice hollow. He knew it was a lie, but it was the only thing he could say. The driver nodded, but he didn't press. There was something understanding in his eyes, something that made Thomas's chest tighten. He didn't deserve this. "Maybe we should talk," the driver said, his tone more serious now. Thomas took a step back, letting him in. His pulse quickened, but this time, it wasn't just the anticipation of what might come. It was a need to confront the truth, to face what had been left unsaid. They moved to the living room in silence, both of them still walking on a fragile line. There was something shifting between them now, something that wasn't just about what had happened physically. It was something deeper, a recognition that things had changed. The driver sat down on the couch, and Thomas took a seat across from him, avoiding his gaze. His hands trembled slightly in his lap. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. "You know this can't go on," the driver said quietly, breaking the silence. Thomas swallowed hard. I know. They were both quiet for a long while, the air thick with tension. Neither of them moved. Neither of them knew what to say next. Finally, Thomas broke the silence. "I don't know how to stop." The driver looked at him, his eyes softening. "Maybe you don't have to. Maybe you just need to decide what you really want." Thomas didn't have an answer. He had no idea what he wanted anymore. All he knew was that nothing in his life felt stable. Emily, the divorce's own confusion. It was all too much to untangle. But for a fleeting moment, with the driver sitting next to him, things felt simpler. It was like finding a rare, quiet moment of peace in a storm that wouldn't end. "I don't know what I'm doing," Thomas admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The driver said nothing at first, but then he shifted, moving closer to Thomas, closing the space between them. "Maybe it's okay to not know," he said softly. "Maybe you just need to let yourself breathe for a while." And in that moment, Thomas felt a weight lifting off his shoulders. For once, he didn't have to carry the burden of his own choices alone. The driver reached out, his hand resting on Thomas's, warm and grounding. It wasn't a promise, not in any concrete sense. But in that brief touch, Thomas felt something he hadn't felt in ages: hope. Prime Regret, Part 8, The Choice. The silence between them deepened. But it wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with understanding, with the weight of everything unsaid. Thomas could feel his heart pounding in his chest, his mind spinning, trying to make sense of everything. The driver's hand remained on his, warm and steady. For a brief moment, Thomas allowed himself to feel that warmth, that fleeting sense of peace. But then the reality of his situation crashed down on him. The divorce, the lies, the mess of his life. He had to face it all. "I can't keep doing this," Thomas said, his voice thick with regret. He pulled his hand away from the driver's, his fingers trembling. "I can't keep pretending like this doesn't matter. It does. Everything does." The driver didn't pull away. Instead, he gave a small nod, his expression unreadable but not judgmental. There was a quiet strength in the way he watched Thomas, and for the first time, Thomas felt truly seen. "Then make a choice," the driver said, his voice soft but firm. "You can keep running or you can face it. Face her. Face yourself." Thomas's chest tightened. The driver was right. He had been running for so long. From Emily, from the truth, from his own feelings. And for what? A fleeting thrill? A temporary escape from a life that no longer made sense? "I don't know how to fix this," Thomas whispered, his voice breaking. "I don't know if I can." The driver leaned forward, his eyes meeting Thomas's. "You don't have to fix it all at once. You just have to start." Thomas's heart ached as the truth of those words settled deep in his chest. Maybe he didn't have to have all the answers. Maybe he just needed to take the first step toward making things right, toward finding some semblance of peace in the wreckage of his life. He stood up, pacing the small room. His mind was racing, back and forth, torn between the life he had left behind and the life he had been hiding from. He loved Emily. He didn't want to destroy her. But what about the part of him that craved something more, something different? Something that wasn't just about routine and expectations? The driver stood up as well, his presence calm but unwavering. "You're not alone in this, Thomas. But you can't keep walking this line, straddling two worlds. You'll only destroy both." Thomas's throat tightened. The weight of the decision pressed down on him harder than anything he had ever faced. He had to choose. He turned to the driver, his eyes filled with pain and understanding. "I need to go back," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "I need to fix this with Emily. I owe her that much." The driver didn't move. He didn't speak, but there was something in his eyes that softened the blow. It wasn't disappointment. It was acceptance. "Then go," he said quietly. "But don't run from yourself. And don't forget that you're worthy of what you want, too." Thomas swallowed hard, feeling a lump in his throat. The truth in the driver's words hit him like a hammer. It wasn't just about Emily. It was about him, too. About taking responsibility. About finding his own truth amid the chaos. With one last look at the driver, at the connection they shared, the bond they formed in a world that was falling apart, Thomas turned and walked toward the door. He opened it, pausing for just a moment, breathing in the cool air. This was the beginning of something new, not with the driver, not in the way he had imagined, but with himself. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to finally stop running.